It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you tonight, the third of our three-part series when the rabbis came to America. And tonight's session is very different than our first two. I usually say everything comes back to the Jewish Center, and at some point soon we'll see how Bernard Drachman comes back to the Jewish Center. But tonight, I actually want to do something a little uncharacteristic, and I want to share a personal connection that I have to the character who forms the backdrop to our story. So, as we'll learn, Rabbi Bernard Drachman spent most of his life as the rabbi of a congregation here in New York City called Zichron Ephraim, better known as Park East Synagogue, and he was the rabbi basically until his death in 1945. And my grandfather and namesake, Rabbi Yosef Yarmish, who was a Musmach of Tarvadas, was his assistant rabbi. And my Aunt Marcy is here, so she can fill in some of those details. And I actually just want to share with you, I have the wedding announcement of my grandparents. There's Rabbi Drachman. And my grandparents were married on D-Day. Easy to remember the anniversary, June 6, 1944. And the following week, there's a story in the Yiddish newspaper, in the Morgan Journal, which tells us a little bit about their wedding in Yiddish. And the article tells us about some of the guests and the Rosh Yeshiva who were there, and Rav Aaron Kotler, and Rav Pinchas Scheinberg, and the president of Zichron Ephraim, president of the shul on 67th Street, where it says here in the article, Mr. Unger, der President von Shul Zichron Ephraim auf 67th Street, New York, wer der Chassan ist jetzt Rav. So it says he's now the rabbi of Zichron Ephraim. So maybe this is just a year before Rabbi Drachman passes away. Maybe he was not up to continuing as the rabbi, or maybe he was Rabbi Emeritus, or at the very least, my grandfather was serving in the assistant rabbi capacity, and maybe was actually Rabbi Drachman's successor. So this story of Rabbi Bernard Drachman actually feels very close to home. So when we learned about Rabbi Bernard Leventhal and Rabbi Yisrael Rosenberg, so there was a theme, which is these rabbis came from Eastern Europe. They spoke Yiddish. They had to do their best to learn about what was happening in the American Jewish scene, and they did their best to adapt and to roll with the punches in this very different and very new environment. Rabbi Bernard Drachman was born in 1861 in America. He was born in New York, and 1861. He's born during the Civil War, which is just stunning to think about. This man who, in the 1940s was serving as the rabbi of Park East Synagogue, was born during the Civil War, and he says some of his earliest memories. His childhood memories were attending with his father a military parade in New York City in 1865. His uncle was a Union soldier. So 1870, his family moves to Jersey City, goes to public high school. And at the time, there was something called the Emmanuel Theological Seminary Association Hebrew Preparatory School. So there's a 6-year kind of pre-college, sort of maybe concurrent with high school training program for people who are interested in rabbinic studies. And then he goes on to Columbia College, where he says he's good friends with Nicholas Murray Butler, who goes on to become president of Columbia University and goes down in history as one of the great anti-Semites in the history of Columbia. So I guess Bernard Drachman's influence on him wasn't enough to prevent Nicholas Murray Butler from being such a Nazi sympathizer and rabid anti-Semite. He graduates Columbia College, and as part of the arrangement with this Emmanuel Theological Seminary, He sent kind of on a scholarship to study in Europe with the idea that he'll come back with rabbinic training, and then he can become a rabbi, maybe at Temple Emmanuel, something like that. He chooses, and this is surprising, he says he sort of has a traditional background, and he has a memoir, which we'll come to soon, which he writes at the end of his life. So hard to know exactly how to judge some of what he writes about his early life, whether or not he's sort of retrojecting back the story of his later life, or how objective an autobiographer can be. But he says, he chose to go to the Breslau Seminary, which, if you ask anybody what was the Breslau Seminary, they'd say that's the Reform Seminary. The Orthodox Seminary was the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin. The Breslau Seminary was a non-Orthodox seminary, even though in the 1880s, many of the teachers would have themselves been practicing or traditional Jews. He has the best time. He has a wonderful experience studying rabbinics in the Breslau Seminary. He had a German background, so he spoke German. It was all very natural to him. Concurrently, he earns a PhD at Heidelberg, which sort of just means he wrote a PhD dissertation which was accepted, and he returns to New York in 1885. I'll just share parenthetically that there's a trip that he mentioned in his memoir. He was a big fan of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, and he took a trip to Frankfurt, and he learned all about the Frankfurt community, but he never met Rav Hirsch. And I'm not sure why, and maybe it was because Rav Hirsch was either away or ailing at that time, but I just leave it as a question mark. Comes back in 1885, and he tells this great story. He says, by the time he came back, he was really committed to traditional Judaism. Retrospectively, we can use the terms Orthodox. Those weren't the terms he was thinking in at the time, but he wasn't interested in Reform Judaism. He didn't want to be the rabbi of a Reform congregation, but he sort of owed it, based on his arrangement with Temple Emmanuel, to at least go through the motions. Temple Emmanuel says, at least come for the praba, come try out, daven with us, give a sermon, and let's have a talk after that happens. Reform Judaism in 1885 is rabid Reform Judaism. Okay, so he writes in his memoir, there's a rule, you're not allowed to wear a yarmulke. So he gets to the shul and he says, look, I wasn't going to daven without a yarmulke. I davened at home. And I also wasn't going to say the name of Hashem without a yarmulke. And so I gave a sermon and just studiously avoided using Hashem's name because I'm standing there with no yarmulke. It's so uncomfortable for me. It doesn't go over well. The board, the leadership of Congregation Temple Emmanuel say we're not going to offer you this position. So he has to look for a new gig, and he takes the position of as rabbi of a congregation called Oheb Shalom in Newark. And again, these are times where there are a lot of shifting boundaries. It's a traditional congregation. A couple years into his rabbinate, they say, I think we're going to do mixed seating. He says, you could do mixed seating, but then I'm not going to continue. And they say, we're going to do mixed seating. And he says, okay. And now he's once again searching for a new congregation. And he becomes the rabbi of a shul in New York City on East 72nd Street. It was called Beth Israel Bikur Cholim. I'm not actually sure what the fate of Beth Israel Bikur Cholim, if it folded into another shul. We'll have to look it up. And we actually have a record. We'll come to it in a few minutes, of the speech that he gave on his installation Shabbos at this congregation. And then a couple weeks later, I'll just share with you, there's a story that appears in the newspaper, which was perhaps telling. And by the way, here is the picture of the Breslau seminar at some point around the time that that Rabbi Drachman would have been there. And here we have an article. This is from the American Hebrew, September 16th, 1887. We note with pleasure that the temporary difference between Congregation Beth Israel Bikur Cholim and their rabbi has been settled in the most harmonious manner. The trustees have presented Dr. Drachman with a resolution expressing their entire agreement with his conceptions of Judaism and their intention of carrying them out in the congregation and in the desired changes, which are to bring the synagogue into complete harmony with the principles of Orthodox Judaism, will be introduced at as early a date as possible. Dr. Drachman will therefore resume his ministrations at once. You see, everyone has to jump through hoops to figure out, like, are we traditional? Are we Orthodox? What direction are we going? Nothing is settled in this moment. We congratulate both congregation and rabbi upon the attainment of this edifying result and the restoration of harmonious and united action and venture to predict that if continued in this spirit, the congregation is certain to accomplish much good and to do substantial work for the benefit of our faith in this community. Once again, the relationship lasts for all of 2 years.
What year was this?
This is 1887 to 1889. Now, right around this time, the Jewish Theological Seminary is getting off the ground, and we'll come back to it, but Rabbi Drachman gets in on the ground floor. The Jewish Theological Seminary, which today we associate with conservative Judaism, opened functionally as a reaction in the 1880s, a reaction to reform, right, to conserve Judaism. And anybody who walked into the Jewish Theological Seminary in the 1880s, would have just assumed that this is a traditional Orthodox, again, without using those terms, but this is the opposite of a reform training seminary, and that's how it functioned in its opening years. And Rabbi Drachman was all too happy to have a position teaching there. 1888, he marries. He marries a woman named Sarah, who happens to be the daughter of Jonas Weil. Jonas Weil is a wildly successful businessman who becomes a major philanthropist and a major Jewish philanthropist at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And in 1889, when Rabbi Drachman is without a congregation, there's sort of a conversation, and the father-in-law says to the son-in-law, or the son-in-law says to the father-in-law, wouldn't it be nice if you had your own place? And so Jonas Weil, together with his brother, buys and builds a property and a site for what today still stands. It's been there a long time. Congregation Zichron Ephraim, again, better known as Park East Synagogue. And it's named Zichron Ephraim in memory of Jonas Weil's father, whose name was Ephraim. And Jonas Weil and his brother provide the backing and the funding to the creation of this new shul on the east side of Manhattan. And functionally, Rabbi Drachman has the run of the place, and he's the rabbi from 1889, 1890 until the end of his life, 1945. Okay. So good longevity for East Side rabbis, and that remains true ad hayom hazeh. Let me say just a few more sort of short pieces about the background and story and biography of Rabbi Drachman, and then I want to transition into 4 or 5 kind of themes that I think we can associate with his life story, and that I hope will be edifying, and that we can take away after this series is over. So again, 55 years, functionally the rabbi of Zichron Ephraim. If you Google him and you find an encyclopedia article or Wikipedia article, it'll say rabbi of Ohab Tzedek, 1909 to 1922, which is bizarre because Ohab Tzedek had a rabbi, and there was nobody else who was the rabbi of Zichron Ephraim. Rabbi Drachman was the rabbi all along. So what is the story there? The story is Congregation Ohab Tzedek, known to us West Siders as OZ, not in its current location, but not far away. Congregation Ohab Tzedek had a rabbi who preached weekly in German, and not just German, but Hochdeutsch, a very high German. And over the course of time, the congregants said, "This is not working for us. We need some English." And so every other week, Rabbi Drachman would walk over to OZ and preach in English. And so he functioned as the rabbi of one shul and the English language preacher of a second shul here on the upper West Side. He was very active in something called the Sabbath Alliance, and we'll come back to that in a moment. His relationship with JTS soured after Solomon Schechter became the president of JTS in 1902. Many of the Orthodox faculty left. Orthodox, we'll say, the traditional faculty left because they didn't see eye to eye with Professor Schechter. And Bernard Drachman stayed. He stayed until 1908, but they never got along. There's some various stories as to what was the difference of opinion between them. But around the time that he left, he started teaching at what was then REITs, and then eventually Yeshiva University and Yeshiva College, and he had a teaching role and leadership role in REITs and YU really for the better part of 30 years. Whenever a new rabbi was installed in a community, it was always Rabbi Drachman who was sort of representative of Yeshiva University for that special occasion. There was a short time where he was the candidate to become the chief rabbi of England in 1912, but as he tells the story, he wasn't entirely sure that his hosts where he was eating on the Shabbos tryout were actually Shomer Kashrus. And so he kind of pretended to eat, but didn't really eat. And as you can imagine, that was not going to be a recipe for a successful tryout to become the chief rabbi of England. It didn't work out. Actually, it was his student, who was Rabbi Hertz, became the chief rabbi at that time, and Rabbi Drachman came back to the United States. I'll just share one sort of funny anecdote from the time that Rabbi Drachman was officiating at Park East. One of the families at Park East was well known because it was the family of Harry Houdini. And Rabbi Drachman actually wrote that in 1890, the parents of Harry Houdini later in life was, very successful financially, but his parents for a time were in financial distress, and they came to Rabbi Drachman and they said, "Can you help?" And Rabbi Drachman said, "Of course, I'll give you money, lend you money, whatever you need." And instead, Harry Houdini's father suggested, maybe as opposed to a gift, maybe, I have a library, why don't you buy some of my books? And that'll be a liquidation of some of our assets. We'll have enough money to make ends meet. So Rabbi Drachman writes, he said, Houdini's father had a very large Hebrew library. And he said he selected a set of the Yad HaChazaka of the Rambam, and he paid a high price to help out the family. He said years later, after Houdini's father had passed away, and Houdini was world renowned, Rabbi Drachman hit him up for a donation for his shul, and Houdini said, "I'll be happy to make a donation, a large donation, but I want the Rambam back." Right. And Rabbi Drachman sort of pointed to this as like evidence for the fact that Houdini was tied to his family and tied to his Jewish roots. And when Houdini passed away, it was Rabbi Drachman who delivered his eulogy. Okay. So let me just pause there and ask if there are any questions or comments. And now I want to focus on 4 or 5 aspects of Rabbi Drachman's career and life. Okay, Marcy, I see you're holding up a newspaper clipping, but you're muted. Okay, so
Okay.
we'll oh,
This
go
is
ahead.
the clipping. It's the original. My mom had it in a shoebox.
Okay, so there it is. You can't do better.
It's
Leave it
very
to Aunt Marcy
yellow,
to
and
have
I
the
will,
original.
your copy is better, but I've made copies of this. I will send it to you.
And I think
This
we have
is
we have
exactly,
some stationery, right? Isn't there some
yes, I'll
stationery
find it. I'll find it. Yeah, from 67th
from
Street.
those times?
Yeah, I have somewhere in my shoebox, right?
Right, and Park East must have an
Yeah,
archive too, where some of this
yeah.
exists. Okay, so the first point I want to make about Rabbi Drachman was his very deep care and concern about the state of Jewish education in America. And again, this has been a theme with all the personalities that we've seen, because Jewish education in America in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century was just in such a shambles. And everyone is lamenting that it's untenable and it's unsustainable and it's terrible. So I'll just share with you one clip. And Rabbi Drachman, as opposed to Rabbi Leventhal and Rabbi Rosenberg, who left no books and very few articles, Rabbi Drachman was a prolific writer. And he wrote articles and he wrote columns in newspapers and he edited journals and he wrote entries in Jewish encyclopedias and he wrote books in English and in Hebrew and in German, right? So it's the opposite job for the historian, as opposed to trying to find and piece together, snippets, right? Where there's not enough information, you have to piece together the story. With Rabbi Drachman, right? There's tons of information and you have to sort of cull it and distill it into the story. So he writes, here's just one quick excerpt. And this was in a newspaper, which is actually basically the Reform newspaper, the American Hebrew, 1902. And Rabbi Drachman wrote about this often. He said, the problem of Jewish education in America, that the religious training of the Jewish youth of this country is conducted with a lamentable degree of inefficiency and incompleteness, is a statement so trite as to be merely a truism. Everybody knows this. Okay, the attempts which are made to train the young of Israel in the faith, the history, and the language of their ancestors are largely haphazard. A certain small proportion receive instruction for a few hours in the religious schools attached to the congregations, which schools are of many diverse kinds, which vary chiefly in the degree of superficiality and inadequacy. It's like one is worse than the next, by which they are characterized. Others derive whatever they know of the tenets of their faith and the learning of their forefathers from voluntary or so-called mission schools, conducted mainly by zealous but entirely incompetent ladies. Others, again, are the victims of all sorts of so-called melamdim, private teachers, the vast majority of whom, though they may possess a certain degree of familiarity with the biblical and post-biblical literature, are entirely devoid of grammatical knowledge of the Hebrew, have not the slightest conception of the need of ethical and spiritual instruction, frequently speak only a barbarous jargon which is repellent to their pupils, familiar with the pure and refined English of the public schools, and hardly ever possess the ability to render interesting to their pupils the things which they teach. Few indeed are the children whose happy lot it is to attend efficient and well-conducted schools, of which American Israel does possess a few, or to study under the direction of able and competent private teachers, and who thus acquire something like an adequate knowledge of Judaism, its sacred literature, its laws, customs, belief, and sublime ideals. So it's just awful. And what are we going to do about it? I have for you another article which he wrote some years later, where he says, you know what the solution is? Jewish public schools. In every district of, let us say, 1,000 Jewish families, such a Jewish public school should stand. It should be cheerful, commodious, light, and well ventilated. It should have at least 5 sessions weekly, 2 to 3 hours each. Its methods should be thoroughly modern and up to date, but its matter should be the ancient subject of Jewish instruction, the Hebrew language, grammatically and thoroughly taught, Bible, prayer book, the ethical and religious duties of the Jew and the Jewess. Special attention should be paid to the teaching of Hebrew hymns and chants, both in order to preserve the knowledge of our traditional melodies and to preserve the next generation for that great and devoutly to be wished for consummation, congregational singing. Okay. So this was a trope. in the life of Bernard Drachman, and he devoted so much of his career and so much of his energy to Jewish education. He taught for years at JTS, and then for the rest of his life at REITs. As I mentioned a minute ago, he published whatever he could publish. One of his important works, and I think it basically remains to this day, the authoritative translation of Hirsch's 19 letters. He said he worked on it for 2 years, and he translated Hirsch's 19 letters from German. You know, Hirsch wrote almost exclusively in German. Rabbi Drachman was a native German speaker, and he gave to the English-speaking Jewish world a translation of Hirsch. And
Rabbi Levine, do you think, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but do you think that when he said barbarous jargon, you think he meant Yiddish?
yes, he absolutely meant Yiddish. Right? There's a kind of ongoing, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit conflict between the native English speakers and the non-native English speakers. And you know, some of us have parents or grandparents who suffered through this, right? The teachers who are teaching, you know, native English speaking kids, but the teacher doesn't speak English, or they speak it with a heavy accent, or every third word is Yiddish, and it's not a great way to get educated when the teacher doesn't speak fluently the language of the kids. So this is an ongoing lament for Rabbi Drachman, and he devoted a lot of time and energy to this issue. Okay, I'll just say sort of on this note, there was something. Rabbi Drachman was very involved in the founding years and the founding activities of what became the Orthodox Union. And there was a part of the Orthodox Union, functionally a part of the Orthodox Union, which was called in its day the Endeavor Society. I'll just share with you, many articles have been written about the Endeavor Society, but Rafi Madoff has a good sort of shorthand summary of what this was about. And he writes the following. In 1900, the Jewish Endeavor Society, functioning as the de facto youth division of the OU, began establishing young people's synagogues that appealed to the younger generation by adding English language sermons and eliminating distasteful practice such as schnuttering. You know that Yiddish word? When you ask for a donation, when somebody gets an aliyah, shen nadar. Schnuttering, publicly announcing a donation pledged by someone called up to the Torah. The rabbis who undertook these initiatives were Rabbi Drachman's students, and Rabbi Drachman was at the helm. Many of them would later go on to establish important mono-Orthodox OU-affiliated synagogues of their own. Especially notable was the Jewish Endeavor's transformation of Shabbat Mincha into the week's major service. Okay, and this is so fascinating. Recognizing that many of their congregants worked on Saturdays until the late afternoon, the Endeavorers decided to create as substantial a Shabbat experience as possible within this reality. They're not coming to shul on Shabbos morning because they're going to work. This, they believed, was the only hope, quote, to recall indifferent Jewry back to their ancestral faith. You got to work with what you got to work with. If they're not coming Shabbos morning, at least give them something Shabbos afternoon. It was an accommodation to the 6-day American work week, to be sure, but was still within the confines of halacha. Okay. So the focus on the youth, the young people, how can we educate them? How can we keep them in the fold? How can we make sure that they have an active relationship to Jewish life and to Torah mitzvos, right? This was a big theme in the life, career, and rabbinate of Rabbi Drach. So I want to transition now into what I think, you know, is arguably the most important, or the most significant contribution that Rabbi Drachman made to his generation of Jewish life, and that has to do with Shabbos. And as an introduction, I just want to share 2 excerpts from his memoir. If you're interested, by the way, it's a 400- or 500-page memoir called The Unfailing Light. I have it here. If you try to buy a copy, I think it's $100 or more, but you can find it in the library. It's called The Unfailing Light, It was published posthumously in 1948, written in the final years of Rabbi Drachman's life. So just two excerpts, which I find fascinating. Okay, the first comes from his time in Europe when he was in seminary, and he traveled. And one of his trips took him to Krakow. Okay, so I mean, it's so fascinating, thing to think about an American kid, basically a college kid, traveling to Eastern Europe in the 1880s. And he describes this scene. He says there was a great public market in Krakow, which occupied a vast square in the heart of the city. I visited this market early Friday afternoon and was much interested in the picturesque and animated scene which met my eyes. The great far extended space was filled with booths and stands displaying all sorts of agricultural products and merchandise. A throng of merchants and customers, of sellers and buyers, milled around them, engrossed in all-absorbing negotiations, bargaining, selling, purchasing. The merchants were almost exclusively Jews. The purchasers, in their great majority, were Polish men and women. The contrast of costumes and types made a fascinating picture. I wandered around the great marketplace for several hours, constantly beholding new and most interesting sights and admiring the perfect harmony and friendly relations which prevailed between the two so different ethnic elements there present. Okay, so the Jewish merchants and the non-Jewish customers. Friday. Suddenly, at about 5 o'clock, a great change took place. All selling and buying ceased. The booths and stands were closed, and Jews and Poles began streaming from the marketplace. The approach of the Sabbath had summoned the Jews to cease all secular activity, and all those of Jewish faith obeyed the summons. That meant the immediate closing of the market, and in less time than it takes to describe it, the great place that had just been filled with human beings in the scene of hustling, bustling activity was empty. Silence had fallen over its vast expanse. Such a beautiful writer. To me, who had never before witnessed such genuine Jewish loyalty and consistency, right? He's this American kid with these Americanized, acculturated Jews living in Jersey City and Newark. To me, who had never before witnessed such genuine Jewish loyalty and consistency, the sight was thrilling. I could not help but contrasting it with America, where it would be hardly possible to parallel it even on the eve of Yom Kippur, Atonement Day, the most sacred day of the Jewish year. Look at everybody keeping Shabbos. Wow. Okay. Scene number 1 from Rabbi Drachman's memoir. Scene number 2, I don't have a year for this, but I'm guessing like 1890s or first decade of the 20th century. He says, one day in conversation with one of the guests at Wilinski's, I learned of the existence of 2 towns in the neighboring state of Rhode Island, Westerly and Ashaway. Anyone ever been to Westerly or Ashaway? Whose inhabitants, Christian Sabbatarians, were strict observers of the Jewish or Seventh-day Sabbath. I think today we would call them Seventh-day Adventists. This information interested me greatly. I was anxious to see a place in America where the Sabbath of Israel was observed by the general community and where its influence was recognizable in the public life of the town, even though those who observed it were not at the seat of the patriarchs. I was determined to make the trip thither and see for myself. I inquired first whether there was any religious Jewish family in either of these towns where I could obtain ritually permitted food. Going to go for Shabbos? Somebody going to have kosher food for me? I was informed that there was such a family in Westerly named Soloveitchik. Okay. My informant added that they were in humble circumstances, the husband being only a customer peddler. I answered their financial condition made no difference to me, so as long as I knew they were conscientious in their Judaism, that their food was ritually permissible. Okay. He goes for Shabbos, and he describes this scene, and he says, everything's closed. The whole town shuts down on Shabbos. I'm walking around. It's unbelievable. And then he writes the following. He says, the religious conditions among the Jews were not nearly as satisfactory as the Seventh-day Adventists. There were only 8 Jewish heads of families in Westerly, 4 of whom kept the Sabbath, while the others did not. The 4 Sabbath keepers were all customer peddlers. The other 4 were storekeepers, and all of them kept their place of business open on the Sabbath day. This condition of affairs made me very indignant. I took the liberty of rebuking one of the Sabbath desecrators, the proprietor of a large establishment. Aren't you ashamed, I said, to be Machalal Shabbos in a place like this? If you were in a place where the Sunday is kept by the majority of the people, you'd have an excuse. You could say that you can't afford to be an exception. But here, where the Gentiles are keeping our Sabbath, you have no such excuse. On the contrary, here by keeping open on the Sabbath, you make yourself an exception and bring a bad name on the Jews. This reality, I believe, is logical and correct, but had no influence on this individual. Okay? But he couldn't help himself, right? A town of Seventh-day Adventists, like, here it is, your perfect opportunity. You could just blend right in as a Shomer Shabbos and you keep your store open. He couldn't help himself. Can't believe it. How could you keep your store open on Shabbos? Okay. Now, I say this by way of introduction to really like a lifelong preoccupation with Shabbos and with Shabbos observance. And just also by way of background, as early as I would say 1870, there were these groups, everyone formed a group, a committee, an organization, incorporated, and there were groups that tried to make a dent and say, oh, people should keep Shabbos and we can do better and we can hold their hands and convince them and persuade them. Sometimes they were successful to some small degree. I'll just give you one example because it's black on white, so it's easy to see. One of the big issues for people in this moment is it's just so hard to keep Shabbos. I'd love to keep Shabbos, but I'll get fired from my job and I can't feed my family if I don't work on Shabbos. So we're not judging anyone. The halacha says you don't do that, but this is what the rabbis were up against. So here's an ad in 1897, the New York Tribune, and there's employment ads, right? It's the whole, classified section. So employment, I'm sorry, it's a little hard to see. Wanted in any capacity with privilege of Sabbath, all in sympathy with the Decalogue as promotive of the spiritual and temporal welfare of humanity, are entreated to the cause. Kindly address the Jewish Sabbath Observance Association, right? Like, you keep Shabbos, we're going to get you a job. Right? We're going to incentivize it for you. We're going to try to make it. Easier. So in 1905, Rabbi Drachman helps found something called the Tomchei Shabbos Association. Sometimes it was called the Jewish Sabbath Alliance or the Sabbath Cooperative Association. It's hard to keep track of all the names. And this is actually amazing because it was aimed primarily at Yiddish-speaking Russian immigrants. And they created a journal in 3 different languages, and they would list businesses that kept Shabbos, and they would try to start an employment bureau so that if you were interested in keeping Shabbos, here's the listings of the places where you could get a job that would accommodate you. 1907, it becomes something called the Jewish Sabbath Association. If you remember, we actually mentioned it, I think, both of our previous sessions. It was Rabbi Israel Rosenberg, who was at one point president of the Jewish Sabbath Association in 1926, when he was doing battle against the Koach Vienna visiting trip that were playing soccer games on Shabbos, right? So it was all part of that same effort, which was really spearheaded, more than any other person, really spearheaded by Rabbi Drachman. I'll just give you a super concrete example from 1909. There are all these blue laws. Blue laws: you're not allowed to open your business on Sunday. Sunday is a Christian holiday. So the Jewish Sabbath Association, right, under the leadership of Rabbi Drachman, has a series of meetings with New York City government officials, and they get these permits. Like, yes, there's a blue law, but every law has an exception. And if you have this certificate, it says you can open your business on Shabbos. And so the association gets like 200 of these certificates. So Like I'd close my store on. I just need 6 days to do my business. If you can get me permission to be closed on Shabbos and open on Sunday, I'll do it. And so the Jewish Sabbath Association helped these would-be Shabbos observers by getting them these dispensations to close their store on Shabbos, right? Because they were able to open their stores on Sunday. Now, in 1918 or thereabouts, the organization merges with something called the Alliance of Israel. Again, Rabbi Drachman becomes the president, and they started lobbying for a 5-day work week. And I'll just share this with you because I think it's so fascinating. Like, who are your partners in this project? Right? So, and it's really interesting to track who the partners are. If you're just by yourself, you're a bunch of minority New York Jews trying to get a 5-day work week, it's very hard. But they start forming alliances. Rabbi Drachman actually traveled to Oakland, California, in 1915, and he gave a speech. We have the transcript of the speech before a Christian convention. Okay, and he writes, and it's so compelling. If you're interested, I could share the whole thing with you, but just a couple of highlights. He says, on what grounds then can it be defended when American states in which no established church exists and which are supposed to look with absolutely impartial benevolence upon all denominations, formally adopt the day of rest enjoined by one faith and force its observance upon all citizens, regardless of the fact that many oppose its observance on religious grounds and keep a Sabbath of their own on another day? If this is not religious tyranny, what is? Okay, so that's a pretty convincing argument. Then he goes on to say, I'll tell you the solution. The solution is, I suggest that the Sunday and Saturday be selected as the days for a 5-day work week with 2 days off, as they already possess in great measure the required characteristics. Christian would observe the Sunday as holy time and the Saturday as secular holiday. The Jew would naturally reverse the process and observe Saturday as Sabbath and Sunday for secular recreation. Business and industry would in this event be discontinued on both days, except as regards the period from sundown on Saturday until midnight, which is not regarded as Sabbath by either religion, which could usefully be employed in providing the necessaries of household on personal use on Sunday. Ironically, and you sort of know the story, these organizations kind of went out of business. In the 1920s, you know who their partner was? Their partner was the labor movement. Okay, so like, leftists, unionists, they were also interested in the 5-day work week, and they're now getting together with their, Christian and Jewish brothers, and this becomes sort of the winning formula. I started to say, ironically, one of the first firms to champion the 5-day work week. Anyone know? One of the first firms to champion the 5-day work week was Ford Automotive. Okay, again, in the same category as Nicholas Murray Butler, Henry Ford, not the biggest friend of the Jews, but ironically, this ends up accruing great benefit to the Jewish community because a 5-day work week really makes it possible for people to observe Shabbos. Okay. So, in a certain sense, the Sabbath Alliance, nobody ever heard of these organizations, Sabbath Association, Sabbath Alliance, they kind of put themselves out of business, which is like best case scenario. They were championing this cause really without too much success until the 20s. But at some point, when the 5-day work week takes hold, like, we're good, right? That major impediment to Shmira Shabbos among Jewish immigrants, it's gone. It's off the table. Now it's possible to get a job, have the weekend off, and not have to get fired at the end of the week because you tell your boss that you need to keep Shabbos. At one point, just a statistic, because I saw it, the bureau that was set up to help people find jobs was basically successful a quarter of the time. They'd have like 2,000 applicants. Can you help me find a Shomer Shabbos position? and they're able to fill about a quarter of them, which means, assuming 2,000 applicants in a year, they helped 500 people find jobs that allowed them to keep Shabbos. Let me just pause there and ask if there are any questions or comments. Okay. So the next session,
Just
yes, Marcy, go
thinking
ahead.
about, will you get to the Young Israel movement?
So
Because they were, when did they start? Around 1912?
Yeah, exactly. I think that is exactly the year.
So they had a whole employment thing.
Yes.
They said, we guarantee you a responsible, efficient worker, and they will make up any work they miss,
Yeah, so I didn't research Young Israel's involvement in this because Rabbi Drachman wasn't involved in the Young Israel. But yes, there's a whole session to be had on the Young Israel movement exactly at this time. So the next section that I want to share with you is Rabbi Drachman's battle against reform. And again, we're at the front lines. You saw it early in his career. These sort of traditional shuls decided to go with mixed seating, and again, it's right after the Pittsburgh platform when he's starting his career, and he has his first-hand exposure. He's a graduate of the Breslau seminary. Like, he knows everything that's problematic from his perspective about the reform movement. So I'll just share with you, because I said I would, this excerpt from his installation speech at in 1887 at this shul on 72nd Street that didn't last. He says, in this the speech, again, we have the whole transcript, and he says, there's two pieces to my speech. I'm going to be your rabbi, and you're going to be my congregant. So I want to tell you what you should expect of me, and I want to tell you what I'm going to expect of you. And he writes the following. He says, a great battle is coming in America. We can already smell the smoke afar. The history of Judaism in this country has but just begun, is still in its infancy. It's like a prophet. And this congregation can be called to play a great part in its future if it will but intelligently and consistently follow in the future its plan in the past. There was a time when people thought, I can remember it well, that all conservatism in this country was destined to dissolution. Conservatism means like traditionalism, was destined to dissolution, that the future belonged to radicalism. By radicalism, he means reform, of the most pronounced type, that whatever could do Judaism in the received sense the greatest and severest injury was destined to the greatest success and the most popular applause. Thanks to Providence, it has been different. As New York goes, so goes the country. And we see that in New York, the extravagances of radicalism are doomed. That the conservative sentiment, JTS just got off the ground, is daily growing stronger. The notorious Pittsburgh Convention, the excesses of certain would-be leaders, and last but not least, the unreasoning onslaughts of the noble institution recently founded, the Jewish Theological Seminary, have weakened radicalism greatly and furthered the growth of a healthy public sentiment. It's his plea, right? And he knows that everyone's sitting on this fence. It could go either way. It's his plea, stick to the tradition and things will go well. And there's a cautionary tale here. If you choose unwisely, it's not going to go well. And you could see the writing on the wall. Rabbi Drachman had a relationship with Mordechai Kaplan. They knew each other. And if you remember, Mordechai Kaplan was hired to be the first rabbi of the Jewish Center in 1917. And he was a controversial guy already at that time. The Jewish Center was finding its way. And in 1921, the leadership of the Jewish Center parted ways with Mordechai Kaplan. I have a copy of his resignation letter written to the president here in my office, sitting at my desk. Rabbi Drachman wanted everybody to know as early as 1921 that Professor Kaplan's views were dangerous. And Professor Kaplan, Rabbi Kaplan, had written 2 or 3 quite stunning and very provocative articles about Jewish theology that were printed in popular Jewish journals. And they evoked a response on the part of Rabbi Drachman. In the interest of time, I'll just share a short snippet. Okay. Rabbi Drachman writes the following. An examination of Professor Mordechai M. Kaplan's views on Judaism. This is an article, I believe, early 1921 in the Jewish Forum. He says, the present article is meant as merely cursory contemplation and criticism of the views and proposals embodied in Professor Mordechai M. Kaplan's 2 articles in the August 1920 issue of the Menorah Journal, November issue of the Maccabean. Can only be cursory because the space at the disposal of a writer in a magazine such as the Jewish Forum would not permit a more thorough treatment. It would require a volume adequately to consider all the ill-grounded theories and concepts which form the basis and supply the content of the articles, and to point out all the misconceptions, half-truths, incorrect assumptions, and illogical conclusions with which they fairly swarm. The cause of causes in producing a breakdown of religious sentiment and practice is the growth of materialistic and naturalistic concept of the universe and the consequent loss of faith in the divine. He says, Professor Kaplan has diagnosed that there's a problem. People are moving away from Judaism. I agree. People are moving away from Judaism. It's not for the reasons that Professor Kaplan has articulated, but rather because people have lost a sense of the divine and they've lost a sense of faith. As long as man is a believer in a personal God, a living supreme being, creator and ruler of the universe, he's essentially religious, even if in his weakness he may permit himself to be forced by economic or social influences to transgress many of the precepts of the faith. And when a man conceives the universe materialistically as the product of blind, inanimate force, he's irreligious, right? It's the sine qua non. Like, if you don't believe in a creator, you're not going to get very far. And then he says, to anyone who reads the articles of Professor Kaplan attentively, it is plainly evident that he is an entire unbeliever in the supernatural, that his real standpoint is that of crass naturalism, although he clothes his views to some extent in phrases with a religious sound. When, for instance, he says that the Jewish people must give up, quote, its mythological views about God for the conception of divinity immanent in the workings of the human spirit, it's hard to understand Mordechai Kaplan. He can only mean that there is no such thing in any real sense as divine revelation, that all the pretended divine messages enunciated by Moses or Isaiah or any other of the prophets of Israel were only the products of the workings of their own human limited intellects, and that they can make no other claim to divine inspiration than, for instance, Shakespeare or Herbert Spencer or Tennyson or any other of the thinkers or poets of humankind. And he goes on. He says, no one else was picking up this mantle, but someone needs to just put pen to paper and say why Mordechai Kaplan's positions are heretical, and here they are. Now, just to bring it back, because we always bring it back to the Jewish Center, I want to share with you a letter that Rabbi Drachman records in his memoir, February 1921. My dear Dr. Drachman, I thank you most sincerely for your kindness in sending me the manuscript of your article, which is to appear in the next issue of the Jewish Forum, an examination of Professor Mordechai M. Kaplan's views on Judaism, the article that we just cited. Okay, so the author of this letter received a copy in advance. I read the article very carefully, and I am bound to say that while you treat the subject in a most temperate manner, laying emphasis on the point that your opposition is to the book, not the author, your arguments are nevertheless most thorough and logical and will, I am sure, appeal not only to the believing and observing Jew, but to the skeptic as well. I'm convinced. Would that we had more such noble, valiant, and ready advocates of Jewish principles and ideals in the defense of which, to quote from your article, countless numbers of men and women have made the supreme sacrifice and died as martyrs. Very truly yours, Joseph H. Cohen, founder of the Jewish Center. And it is shortly after this correspondence that the Jewish Center parts ways with Mordechai Kaplan. So hard to pick up causation, and these things, brew over time, and it's not one article or one letter that shifts the balance. But there is no question that Bernard Drachman's attack on Mordechai Kaplan reached the desk of Joseph Cohen, and certainly was, top of mind when he and the other leaders of the Jewish Center were making the decision about whether to retain the services of their rabbi, whom they had begun to understand was in fact quite radical indeed. Okay, we're just about out of time. Before we wrap up, I'll just show you one final source and use it as a window onto one final section of the life of Bernard Drachman, and that is, like his East European contemporaries who we learned about in the last 2 weeks, Rabbi Leventhal and Rabbi Rosenberg. Rabbi Drachman was also a staunch advocate of Zionism, and he played an active role in Mizrahi. And he actually had a correspondence with, and maybe even met with, Rabbi Kook. And again, just to share one final source, because I think it's so stunning. In 1920, Rabbi Drachman wrote a book in Hebrew called Hagalut Betoch HaGeula. And what I think is so fascinating about it is that here's the description. The book is by Me'et Harav Dr. Dov Drachman. Okay. Hadfasa Miyuchedet Mehatoren. This is a journal that put this out. V'nilveh lezeh ha'ara chashuva me'et harav ha'gaon Rabbeinu Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. So there's the content of the book, and there's an important ha'ara, an important note, an important observation of Rav Kook. 1920, right? This is before he's even the chief rabbi. It's after World War I. He'd moved back to Palestine, and he's soon to become the chief rabbi, but again, he's known on the world stage. And then if you open up the book, and I just reversed the order, but before the book, before the contents that were published by Rabbi Drachman, is the ha'ara of Rav Kook. Right, and what are they fighting about? And again, I'm not going to do this justice because we're out of time. But Rabbi Drachman basically says, there are a lot of people who are Zionists. They don't believe in the Torah, and they don't believe in Hashem, and they're not keeping the mitzvos. And okay, but they're helping build Zionism. And you read his words, you're like, oh, that's like a Rav Kook kind of thing to say. Like, the secular Zionists, they're playing their part. And then you read Rav Kook's note, and Rav Kook goes to town and says, no, that's with all due respect to Rabbi Drachman, I totally disagree. If there are people who are totally secular and they're building up the Zionist enterprise, they're only contributing to half the Zionist enterprise, because the Zionist enterprise is physical and spiritual. And if these people don't believe in the Torah and the mitzvos and the spiritual aspirations of the Zionist state, then they're only playing half the role that they could be playing, and we have higher aspirations. The goal is for everyone. The goal is for everyone to play both a physical and spiritual role in the upbuilding of the state of Israel. We're out of time. There's much more to say, and I'll be happy to stay on and take questions. But I'll just say in closing that Rabbi Drachman sort of was able to straddle all these different worlds, and maybe partially because he was American and had the English and had the background, but he was a scholar in the true sense of the word. He was a rabbi in the true sense of the word, a communal leader for over 50 years in his congregation, and an activist. And you see that the role he plays, goes well beyond the Daled Amos of his congregation, but campaigns for Shabbos observance and for people to be able to lead lives and have jobs and be able to keep Shabbos, and making partnerships and alliances with all kinds of other groups and organizations to promote these goals. All the while, JTS first, and then at REITs, teaching Torah, publishing, writing, and becoming a model on the world stage of what it means to promote traditional Jewish life in America in these early decades of the 20th century. And as I pointed out just in passing, he was also able to build this bridge. In a lot of ways, we think of like there's these two worlds. There's the Americanizers and the English speakers on the one hand, and then the immigrants and the Russians and the Polish and the Yiddish speakers on the other. And Rabbi Drachman, again, because of his unique circumstance and his unique talents, in many ways was able to bridge the gap in common cause with both the English speakers and the Yiddish speakers, who were all trying to fill in the blank, keep Shabbos, learn Torah, do mitzvos, be Jewish in America in the early 20th century. To Rabbi Leventhal, to Rabbi Rosenberg, to Rabbi Drachman, and to all of their contemporaries and colleagues, we who live wonderful Jewish lives in 21st century America are indebted to their activities, to their advocacy, to the groundwork that they laid so that we could lead the lives that we lead today. I'm going to wrap up here, but happy to stay on and take any questions or comments.
Before you showed the sefer where he alluded